The Europeans landed at the site of what is today Mole St. Nicholas on December 6, 1492. Upon arriving on the island of Haiti, Columbus and his crew were welcomed by the Taino natives, who were peaceful and receptive to the Europeans. The Tainos were curious about the newcomers, and Columbus was also eager to learn more about their culture. Christopher Columbus was captivated by the beauty and natural resources of Hispaniola. He described the island as a paradise, with fertile lands, abundant gold, and a pleasant climate. Columbus believed that the island had great potential for colonization and resource extraction, which would benefit Spain and further its imperial ambitions. The island of Haiti was divided into 5 distinct chiefdoms or provinces, each with its own cacique or chief. The 5 chiefdoms were Marin, Magua, Maguana, Zaragua, and Higüey. Marin was led by Guacanagarix. Magua, located in the northeast, was led by Garionex. Maguana, in the central part of the island, was led by a cacique named Cayanabo. This chiefdom was known for its mountains and would become the center of resistance against Spanish colonizers. Zaragua was located in the southwestern part of the island and was led by Bohiquio. After Bohiquio's death in the late 1490s or early 1500s, likely due to illness or natural causes, Anaquona, his sister and the wife of Cayanabo, became his successor. Higüey was in the eastern part of the island and was led by a cacique named Cayacoa. Guacanagarix, who ruled the region of Marin, was one of the first indigenous leaders to meet Christopher Columbus and his crew upon their arrival. He was friendly and cooperative. On Christmas Eve night, December 24th to 25th, 1492, while a cabin boy was alone at the helm of the Santa Maria, the ship ran aground on a reef. The ship was lost, and only the help of the natives allowed most of the cargo to be unloaded in an emergency. Guacanagarix offered his help and allowed Columbus to establish the settlement of La Navidad on his territory, using the remains of the ship as construction materials. Christopher Columbus was forced to leave 39 men behind. He took some natives hostage and continued his exploration. He continued to sail along the northern coast of Hispaniola with just one ship until he met Pinzon and the Pinta on January 6, 1493. On January 13, 1493, Columbus made his final stop of this voyage in the New World, in Rincon Bay, northeastern Hispaniola. There he encountered the Saguayos, the only natives who offered violent resistance during this voyage. The Saguayos refused to trade the number of bows and arrows that Columbus desired. During the ensuing confrontation, one Saguayo was stabbed in the buttocks and another wounded by an arrow in the chest. Because of these events, Columbus named this bay the Gulf of Arrows, Golfo de las Flechas. He then headed for Spain. After Columbus left for Spain, leaving 39 men behind at the La Navidad settlement, the situation quickly deteriorated. The men left behind by Columbus were under the command of Diego de Arana and were instructed to maintain good relations with the Taino natives, gather gold, and wait for Columbus' return. Several factors contributed to the downfall of La Navidad during Columbus' absence. Firstly, the men left behind failed to maintain a respectful and cooperative relationship with the Tainos. Instead, they began to exploit the local population, demanding food and women and taking resources by force. This behavior created tension and animosity between the Spaniards and the Tainos. In addition, internal conflicts and power struggles among the Spanish settlers weakened the group's cohesion and effectiveness. The men were ill-prepared to face the challenges of life in an unknown environment and lacked discipline and foresight to establish a sustainable and well-defended settlement. Alarmed by the Spanish presence and the disruptions they caused, Cayanabo, the powerful Taino cacique of the Maguana region, orchestrated an attack on the settlement. The Taino forces overwhelmed the Spaniards, leading to the destruction of La Navidad and the death of the 39 men left behind. When Columbus returned to Spain in March 1493 after his first voyage, he was greeted with much enthusiasm and interest. His discovery of the New World was seen as a monumental achievement, and he was celebrated as an accomplished explorer and navigator. Queen Isabella and King Ferdinand were particularly pleased with his discoveries, as they had financed his expedition in hopes of finding new trade routes and valuable resources. Columbus presented the Spanish monarchs with some of the natives he had captured from the New World, as well as various exotic items such as gold, parrots, and plants, including tobacco. These items further fueled the excitement and curiosity of the Spanish court and the general population. The success of Columbus' first voyage encouraged King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella to finance a second expedition to further explore and colonize the newly discovered lands. Preparations for the second voyage began shortly after Columbus returned to Spain, and this time, the scale of the expedition was much larger. The second voyage aimed to establish a permanent presence in the New World and take advantage of the wealth and potential resources of the discovered lands. The fleet for the second voyage consisted of 17 ships, including both large and small vessels, and carried about 1,200 settlers, including soldiers, farmers, artisans, and priests. The settlers were equipped with various supplies, tools, livestock, and seeds necessary to establish a self-sustaining colony. The second expedition also had a more ambitious exploration agenda, aiming to discover new islands and territories in the Caribbean and beyond. When Columbus returned to Hispaniola on this second voyage in November 1493, he discovered the unfortunate fate of the 39 men he had left at La Navidad. The settlement had been destroyed, and all the men had been killed. Columbus learned from the Taino people, including the Cacique Guacanagrics, that the Spanish settlers had misbehaved, mistreated the locals, and seized resources. This behavior had led to tensions and ultimately, to the attack on La Navidad by Cayanabo's forces. Realizing that he needed to establish a new settlement elsewhere, Columbus decided to move east along the northern coast of Hispaniola. On January 2, 1494, he founded the permanent settlement of La Isabela in what is now the Dominican Republic. La Isabela was named in honor of Queen Isabella of Spain and was to serve as the main Spanish settlement in the New World.
Chapter 6. Time of Troubles. Africa's time of tragedy and decline started both in Europe and in Africa itself. For more than 1,000 years, Africans had been bringing into being empire after empire. But the opening of Europe's era of exploration, Africa's own internal strife, and the slave trade turned what had been Africa's golden age into a time of troubles. The Crusades may be called the beginning of Europe's reawakening. A religious fervor, not unrelated to politics, had stirred Europeans out of their lethargy and their indifference to the larger world. The First Crusade began in 1095, was precipitated by the Seljuk Turks, whose persecution of Christians had placed even Constantinople in jeopardy. The eastern heads of the church appealed to Pope Urban II for help. At a church council in France, the Pope pointed out that if Constantinople fell to the Turks, Western Europe would soon be overrun. He made an eloquent plea to the kings and princesses, and the kings and princes gathered into all Western European Christendom to rally to the aid of Christians in the East and to drive the infidels from the Holy Land. This religious crisis gave Europe a semblance of unity, and although it can be said that the Crusades were military and religious failures, they did provide the opportunity to bring in new information to Europe. The religious wars also had a profound effect on the political development of Europe. The Western monarchs were able to strengthen their authority and develop a strong central government, while many members of their turbulent aristocracies were fighting in the Holy Land. Contact with the East had a deep and lasting effect on the Crusades, who belonged to a civilization where culture and learning had almost vanished during the Dark Ages. The princes in their castles and the peasants in their huts were equally ignorant and uneducated. When they arrived in the East, they soon realized how backward were the people of the West. They marveled at the beautiful cities, the thriving commerce, the busy industries, the art, and the learning. The impetus for exploration was fueled by what the Crusaders met along the way. Ships built to ferry the Crusaders to the Holy Land returned laden with the products of the East, the cargoes of spices, fruits, rich silks, satins, velvets, and other luxury goods had found a ready market. Thus, the Crusades brought into being the first attempts to open fresh trade routes to the East. Early in the 15th century, Europeans searched for new worlds to conquer and of a food supply to feed the continent's hungry population, began to venture across the seas. North Africa, by 1492, was confronted with the painful fact of its waning influence in the Mediterranean Europe. Spain and Portugal had been broken of the yoke of North African domination, were asserting themselves as powerful independent nations with colonial aspirations in the lands of their former conquerors. Islam, a great religious and military force in North Africa and the Middle East since the latter part of the 7th century, was torn apart by internal strife and bickering. The relationship of North Africa and the people of the Western Sudan was deteriorating. For hundreds of years, this relationship had been good. Africans from the Western Sudan had participated in large numbers in the conquest of Spain in the year 711. These Africans made up the major military force that kept Spain under North African domination, and they participated in that country's intellectual life and is still reflected in Spain's art, culture, and literature. In order to understand this neglected aspect of history, the role of Africans in the conquering and ruling of Spain, it is necessary to go back to a time to retell, at least briefly, the part that Black Africans played in the rise of Islam and in the spread of Islamic influence to Mediterranean Europe. Welcome back. Welcome back. Welcome back. Happy Monday. Welcome back to On the Shoulders of Giants. I am Joseph Ward, continuing my reading of Dr. John Henrik Clarke's book, Christopher Columbus and the African Holocaust, Slavery and the Rise of European Capitalism. This is chapter 6, Time of Troubles. And for this video today, I'm reading chapter 6 and chapter 7. Chapter 6 starts on page 61. Chapter 7 starts on page 65. And chapter 7 is Sorrow in the Land. And chapter 7 goes to page, hold on, let me make sure. Chapter 7 goes to page, okay, I was right. Chapter 7 goes to page 75. So chapter 7 is from 65 to 75. All right, so the time of troubles. So Dr. Clarke is talking about the events that led up to the transatlantic slave trade, the events that led to destruction of African civilizations even more by the Europeans, the events that led to the destruction of the Caribbeans, and eventually led to the destruction of the continent of the United States of America. Well, the landmass of North America, right? We'll say that, right? The landmass of North America and the area that became the United States of America. But he's dealing with the why, with the how we got there, right? So that's what we're starting off with, because he's talking about the Crusades and how the Crusades, yes, depleted Europe of resources, people, helped to introduce famine, poverty, like all these things. But what it did was it helped to ignite a united warring spirit in the Europeans, which was important. Think about what I just said. A united warring spirit, because the Europeans were uniting under the banner of ridding the land of the infidels, the invading Moors, the invading Africans, the invading Jews, ridding the land of the infidels so that Europe could rise again, so Europe could become a power. And the Crusades were, remember, wars against the Christians, Muslims, and Jews. And even though they're saying like the Christians were taking a lot of losses, they were unifying under the banner of Christendom, because Constantinople was already an important Christian stronghold due to the actions of Constantine. Okay, I'm tripping. Yeah, I had a brain fart. Constantinople was already a Christian stronghold because of the acts of Constantine. So leading into the Crusades, you had these three religious groups and these three political groups as well, fighting for these specific lands, these holy lands in North Africa and around the Mediterranean, right? So in all the lands in the East and in all the areas that they were fighting for during the Crusades, that helped to deplete Europe of its resources, its people. but it ignited a warring spirit. It united people under the banner of Christianity, and we will defend Christendom, which was important because the more they united, the more Europe united, the stronger they became. And the stronger they became, they were able to further resist the Moors, resist the Arabs, resist the Africans. They were able to fight them off and gain back control over parts of Europe. The last part was Grenada. When Isabella and Ferdinand got together, that made Europe even stronger. And they were able to finally expel the infidels, correct? And then that kicked off into the rebuilding of Europe, which is what we're going to get into, especially in the next chapter. Right now, that's why I'm starting off with the video about the Taino people, because, you know, we talk a lot about the transatlantic slave trade, but we never really get into the people who were in the Caribbean before the Africans were brought there to be slaves, before the Europeans got there. We kind of gloss over it. So it's to give us a better understanding of who the Taino, the Carib people are. Now, the term Arawak is used, and the term Arawak is used in this book, but from my understanding, the term Arawak is a derogatory term. It's a European term. The correct terms are more so Taino or Carib. So, and even Carib is not necessarily a native name of them. So, you know, go more with Taino, but giving an understanding of those people who existed in the Caribbean, right? Giving them their flowers, because those people were replaced by the Africans and in some sense mixed with the Africans, because the Tainos aren't completely gone. A lot of Tainos were forced to mix with the Africans and or the Spanish or the Portuguese, right? So all of these people were affected by the transatlantic slave trade, by the actions of Christopher Columbus, by the uniting of Europe under the banner of Christendom. So this is where we're going with this, right? So getting back into it, page 62, the final paragraph. In order to understand this neglected aspect of history, the role of Africans in conquering and ruling Spain, it is necessary to go back in time to retell, at least briefly, the part that Black Africans played in the rise of Islam and in the spread of Islamic influences to the Mediterranean Europe. Oh yeah, before I get any further, remember to hit that like button, comment, subscribe, share. I almost forgot. Hit that like button, comment, subscribe, share this video. Make sure as many people as possible has a chance to come across this information, support this information, gather this information, learn this information, utilize this information. This is important information, an important book for us to really understand the whys behind how we got here, written by Dr. John Henry Clark. Like this video, hit that like button. Let's go. So after consolidating their position in Spain, the Muslims began to establish institutions of research and learning, whose brilliance was felt far beyond Spain's borders. This was an achievement not of the Arabs alone. It was brought into being by a combination of Arabs and Africans, collectively referred to by the Europeans as Moors. The word Moor ended the vocabulary of Europeans by meaning of blacks, as in a blackamoor. By the end of the 14th century, Southern Europe had gained enough strength, right? What I'm just talking about. I'm going to read that again. By the end of the 14th century, Southern Europe had gained enough strength, military and otherwise, to challenge their African and Arab masters. By the end of the 15th century, the Arabs and Moors had lost all Spain except the Kingdom of Grenada, like I said earlier, right? The Christians, although they also had their internal disputes, they were finally united, right? The marriages of Ferdinand and Isabella joined the formerly hostile royal houses of Aragon and Castile, and together their forces blockaded the city of Grenada. After 8 months, the Moorish governor finally surrendered. This marked the end of an era. Europe had literally been reborn. The Africans who had planted the seeds of progress in Southern Europe had not made the best use of the harvest that followed. The progress and excitement that had inspired Europe during the 15th century and had carried medieval Europe over into the modern world had brought no progressive changes to North Africa, now rocked with conflict. In the countries of North Africa, especially Morocco, Political stagnation seemed to be the general rule, and strong men with selfish intent found their opportunities to seize power. They no longer protected the poets and scholars. They left no monuments to embellish the conquered cities. To North Africans, the 15th century was a time in which Spain was a lost and hated land, a century in which Portugal robbed North Africa of a large part of its western seacoast. The news in 1492 of Christopher Columbus's discovery of the New World came swiftly to the courts of Fez, Marrakesh, and Cairo, and was no cause for rejoicing. So that's the end of chapter 6, time of troubles. So chapter 7, sorrow in the new land. But think about what I'm talking about. The precursor to what happened, to how African people were displaced throughout the Western Hemisphere, to how Taino people in the Caribbean almost were all wiped out, right? What happened to the Tasmanians is almost what happened to the Tainos, genocide. Same thing with the Native Americans, indigenous Americans who inhabited these lands that we now call the United States of America. Either forced to assimilate or wiped out, right? So that happened because Europe was able to strengthen itself. Europe was able to strengthen itself because they started uniting under ideas that they all felt would benefit them. So these uneducated, savage people who spent time killing themselves, catching diseases, not bathing, doing all this uncivilized stuff, were at least civilized enough to unite under a common cause to defeat their enemies. What the hell is wrong with us? Well, a part of that is the programming. That's why you program people, because the Europeans had already understood from their history. So that's why you program people to help ensure that those people don't revolt. The psychology is an important part. All right, chapter 7, sorrow in the new land. When in 1492, Columbus, representing the Spanish monarchy, discovered the New World, he set in train that long and bitter international rivalry, colonial possessions for which, after 4.5 centuries, no solution has yet been found. Portugal, which had inhabited the movement of international expansion, claimed the new territories on the ground that they had fell within the scope of the papal bull of 1455, authorizing her to reduce to servitude all infidel peoples. The two powers, to avoid controversy, sought arbitration and, as Catholics, turned to the Pope, a natural and logical step in an age when the universal claim of the papacy were still unchallenged by individuals and governments. After carefully sifting the rival claims, the Pope issued in 1493 a series of papal bulls which established a line of demarcation between the colonial possessions of the two states. The east went to Portugal and the west went to Spain. The partition, however, failed to satisfy Portuguese aspirations, and in the subsequent year, the contending parties reached a more satisfactory compromise in the Treaty of Tordesillas, which rectified the papal judgment to permit Portuguese ownership of Brazil. So, the above quote from Eric Williams's neoclassic work, Capitalism and Slavery, first published in 1499, places its focus in international situation, places in focus an international situation that started in the latter part of the 15th century that's still alive with us on this eve of this 21st century, and is still alive today in 2025. Michael Bradley's book, The Columbus Conspiracy, is a well-researched inquiry into this event that changed the world for all times to come. This event set in motion the Atlantic slave trade that made possible the economic rise of Europe and the expansion of the influence and domination of European people throughout most of the world. Christopher Columbus is best known of a number of Western thugs and murderers who had been presented to this world as a hero and discoverer. A future examination of his actions will prove that he had no regard for the people he encountered on the islands in the Caribbean, and he did not appreciate their initial friendship toward him and his crew. A fact that is often overlooked is that a large number of the crew of these vessels of Christopher Columbus were criminals let out of jail to go on this voyage because it was difficult to recruit others because of the apparent danger of such a mission. The following extracts come from Journal of the Western Voyage of Christopher Columbus. Journal of the First Voyage of Christopher Columbus, 1492 to 1493 by Eric Williams, page 52. That clearly indicate his attitude toward the indigenous people of the Caribbean islands and the Africans he had previously met. The Portuguese generally referred to the west coast of Africa as Guinea. It also indicates that Christopher Columbus could have been participating in the early Portuguese slave trade. So the enslavement, and this comes from the Eric Williams's book, the enslavement of the Aboriginal Indians, right? They should be good servants and intelligent. For I observed that they quickly took in what I said to them. Sunday, 14th of October. These people are very simple as regards to the use of arms, as your highness will see from the 7 that I have caused to be taken to bring home and to learn our language and return, unless your highness should order them to all be brought to Castile or to be kept as captives on the same island. For with 50 men, they can all be subjugated and made to do what is required of them. Monday, 12th of November. Yesterday, a canoe came alongside the ship with 6 youths in it. 5 came on board, and I ordered them to be detained. They are now here. I afterwards sent to a house on the western side of the river and seized 7 women, old and young, and 3 children. I did this because the men would behave better in Spain if they had women of their own land without them. So that was from Eric Williams's book. So the following statement or the following comment is taken from his speech. It's Time We Rethink Our History by David R. Stidham at the first celebration of the African American culture and history at Stratford High, Nashville, Tennessee, published in 1990. Okay. So this is what David R. Stidham is saying. When we begin to rethink our history, we understand why history books were wrong. We were all miseducated. Columbus did not discover America. The historical facts in December 1492, Columbus was totally lost, wandering around the Caribbean islands thinking he was in Asia. When he was discovered by a native Arawak or Taino Americans who lived in these islands. Actually, it was the Taino's ancestors whose 50,000 years before Columbus discovered the Americas when they walked across the land bridging the Bering Strait. Columbus didn't discover anything. He was so confused and lost. He thought he was in India and called the Tainos Indians. Christopher Columbus was considered as a saint by the European who hailed his great so-called discovery. We need to rethink our history. Columbus was no saint, and the Taino were not uncivilized savages, like the African who came to the America before and after Columbus. These were gentle people with a rich culture who worshiped the one creator. When we begin to rethink our history, we begin to put into historical perspective the true role of Europeans in our 500-year history. The prosperity, the wealth, the good European lifestyles we enjoy today in America began in 1492 from its infant beginnings. This prosperity grew out of slavery. You see, slavery did not begin with the importation of African people to America. Slavery in America began with Columbus. The first slaves were not Africans, but Native Americans. Columbus wrote in his journals, the inhabitants of I-80, present-day I-80, all the inhabitants could be taken away to Castile or Spain or made slaves on the island. With 50 men, we could subjugate them all and make them do whatever we want. In truth, that is exactly what he did. Columbus enslaved the gentle Taino Haitians, forced them to give up their gold and their land. After all he had discovered these riches, they were his for the taking. What is also true is Columbus took hundreds of Taino slaves to Spain, where they were sold or died. They didn't freely go with Columbus to meet the king, as many history books led us to believe. In his quest for gold, Columbus had the hands cut off of any Taino who did not bring in his or her quota of gold. In a short 40 years, listen to this. In a short 40 years, the entire race of the people of Haiti, 500,000 Native Americans, were wiped off the face of the earth by Columbus and the Spaniards that followed him. No, Columbus was no saint. We need to rethink our history. And so show you some books. So we talked about these books. We talked about these books in previous videos. Bartolome de las Casas, a short account of the destruction of the Indies. A book you need to get to learn more about what happened with Christopher Columbus. Bartolome de las Casas, a short account of the destruction of the Indies. Christopher Columbus, The Four Voyages. Get these books so you can learn more about it. Christopher Columbus, The Four Voyages. From Columbus to Castro, The History of the Caribbean. Get these books. And you can also get my fourth book, On the Shoulders of Giants, Volume 4, The Caribbean, because I talk about what happened, how the Caribbean came to be in the beginning of my fourth book, On the Shoulders of Giants, Volume 4, The Caribbean. All right. So non-European people, especially Africans and the indigenous Americans in the Caribbean islands referred to as Indians, initially attributed to the Europeans a humanity and spirituality that they did not have and still do not have in their relationship with most of the non-European people of the world. This was a weakness in dealing with the aggressive Europeans, and not to some extent it still is. Christopher Columbus was the forerunner of the European aggressor and the land grabber of today. They have justified this action in this regard in the name of God, using the assumption that people were being brought under the influence of civilization. This indeed was a contradiction because the act committed against the people was uncivil. When a people assume that their God approves of their criminal action against another people, they have made God ungodly. In many ways, the Europeans' misuse of religion has destroyed the spirituality, and that was initially the basis of all religion. The Carib and the Taino Indians were curious about Christopher Columbus and his crew, and at first treated them as strange and new guests in their homes. They did not know that soon after the arrival, the guests would turn on the host and make them slaves. The destruction of the Caribs and Arawaks, or the Tainos in the Carib and the Caribbean islands, through disease, rape of their women, and sometimes all-out murder, destroyed the labor supply on the islands and made it necessary for the Spaniards and other Europeans to create a rationale for the enslavement of the Africans. In his book, Destruction of the Indies, Bartolome de las Casas, right, estimates that from 12 to 25 million indigenous Americans were killed on the islands in the Caribbean. From 12 to 25 million were killed. The school books that indicate that Christopher Columbus was on a civilizing mission are a disservice to students and teachers who should be in rebellion against them. Christopher Columbus was a terrible person. He was a terrorist. Christopher Columbus and his crew could have formed a successful partnership with the Indians that would have been to the benefit of them both. While Christopher Columbus still prevails as a major hero to the Western world, sometimes in the not too distant future, if African and Indian scholars who are descendants of those who were murdered start writing books about the opening up of the New World and start using new and old documents, especially the work of Bartolome de las Casas, Christopher Columbus will emerge as one of the greatest villains in human history, which indeed he was. When this revelation becomes apparent to most of the world, I still think there will be a need for Columbus Day, but it will be a justifiable day of mourning for the millions of Africans and so-called Indians or the Taino or Native Americans who died to accommodate the spread of European control, white supremacy over the Americas and the Caribbean islands. Christopher Columbus had helped to set in motion the Atlantic slave trade, the greatest single Holocaust in human history. Modern day scholars who have one-dimensional view of history, mostly partial to Europe, are not ready to consider the fact of the pre-Columbian presence of several different national groups before Columbus. Going back as far as 10,000 BC, Professor Ivan Sertiman's book, Ivan Van Sertima's book that came before Columbus, The African Presence in Ancient America, is clear on the subject. The Vikings came in a hurry and obviously left in a hurry. They left little evidence of their culture and of their art and no evidence of their literature. This must have been a culture in transition. Excuse me. The Vikings must have been a culture in transition. The pre-Columbian presence of Orientals in the New World had been alluded to and partially documented in a number of books, such as Ancient Egyptians and Chinese in America by R.A. Jerazahoy. I'm messing that name up, but R.A. Jerazahoy. And Columbus was Chinese discoveries and inventions of the Far East by Hans Brewer. This early meeting of Africans, the Orientals, and the Indians was a complementary infusion of culture that today could be a lesson for the whole world, because in all that we have learned in documents, there wasn't even a hint of war between these cultures and people. This brings us to a conclusion that might be difficult for a lot to accept. Maybe the world outside of Europe didn't need the Europeans in the first place. Maybe in this fakery about spreading civilization, he destroyed more civilization than he ever built and did more harm than good. Maybe. What I learned from reading the literature on this subject is that this early meeting between indigenous Americans, Orientals, and Africans was a laboratory in human relationship, because it proved that different people of different cultures and religions and colors coexist and complement each other without dominating or attempting to destroy each other. We find the personality of Christopher Columbus and his associates constantly recurring in the early parts of this drama about the opening of what is referred to as the New World. Little emphasis is placed on the fact that Christopher Columbus wasn't too clear about where he was and knew nothing about the people he met and the lands he allegedly discovered. Instead of being and mentioning of the cultures and an amalgamation of cultures complementing each other by infusion, Christopher Columbus set in motion a tragic clash of culture that has not ended to this day. This clash of cultures is caused by the arrogant assumption on the part of some Europeans that they are the only people who ever produced anything worthy of being called a culture. The following entry in Christopher Columbus's diary is taken from Documents of Western History, Volume 1, 1492 to 1665, from the Spanish discovery of the British conquest of Jamaica, edited by Eric Williams. Tuesday, 15th of January, the intercourse at Cashapp would, however, be difficult because the natives are said to eat human flesh. The admiral determined to go there, and it was on the route and thence to Mathinado. Blank was said to be entirely peopled by women without men. He would thus see both islands and take some of the natives. That's strange. That's weird. Let me try to read that again. Tuesday, 15th of January, the intercourse at Cashapp would, however, be difficult because the natives are said to eat human flesh. So he's saying having intercourse with the Cashapp women would be difficult because they are said to be cannibals. Okay, gotcha. So they want to take the Cashapp women, but they think that the Cashapp women are cannibals. In this entry on the 15th of January, Christopher Columbus infers to some of the people of the Caribs, or the Carib people, or the Taino people, or the people specifically in Puerto Rico as cannibals. This is one of the most present myths, coming mainly for Europeans, using it as a rationale to reduce some non-European people to servitude. This charge is often made and rarely proven. Ironically, the charge of cannibalism is more often charged to a people who in their society have more than an adequate supply of non-human meat. Those making the charge generally come from a society that has been historically short of non-human meat. From this deduction, I leave it up to the individual reader to arrive at his or her own conclusion. Monday, the 18th of February, he pretended to have gone over more ground to mislead the pilots and Marines who picked off the charts in order that he might retain master of the route to the Indies, as in fact he did. for none of the others kept an accurate reckoning, so that no one but himself could be sure of the route to the Indies. In this entry on the 18th of February, there is a clear indication of deception between Christopher Columbus and his pilots. If he originally set out to go out to the East Indies, why did he go to the West Indies? This is why the indigenous people, the Caribs and the Arawaks, are referred to as the Indians. This aspect of the Columbus saga begs for investigation over and beyond the Christopher Columbus hero worshippers who have written a library of books about his complex individual who we still do not know. So a whole library of books have been written about Columbus, but Dr. Clark is inferring that people still haven't done a deep dive on Christopher Columbus, haven't gone deep enough. In chapter 2 of his book, The Columbus Conspiracy, Michael Bradley goes beyond the personality of Christopher Columbus and deals with the possibility that they were previous explorers in the Americas, such as Carthaginians and the Phoenicians. In this speculation, Michael Bradley is not only telling us more things that we need to know about early exploration, he is also telling us about human curiosity and relationship to exploration. In this chapter, Echoes of Ancient Truth, Michael Bradley alludes to the late development of the nation state in Europe and the still slower development of a uniform language and culture that Europeans could understand. One to the other. Today, this would seem like a contradiction because in most textbooks and in mass media, the European is presented to the world as though he arrived culturally pure and endowed with the knowledge and the mandate to lead the world. What Michael Bradley has said in this chapter is that Europeans, like all other people in the world, had to endure a long and hard struggle before arriving at a state and a condition that could justify what is being called as civilization. Europeans lack the understanding of most of the peoples of the world, mainly because they lack an understanding of themselves. In a previous chapter of this book, Michael Bradley takes up a more dangerous issue. The issue deals with the possible Jewish input in the New World discovery and the medieval roots of internal religious conflicts in Europe affecting the segment of the Jewish. He alludes to some misconceptions we might still have about the personality of Jesus Christ, his early life, and his relationship to the Jewish people of biblical times. This chapter is both topical and historical roots, putting on the agenda for discussion some little-known aspects of the Christian story and its relationship to the role of Jewish people in world history. This chapter, carefully read, might start debates, fistfights in some places, and it might also cause the author, Michael Bradley, to seek a hiding place. Mr. Bradley alludes to the assumption that the royal house of France could have been Jewish and that the Jewish bloodline came into Europe in this manner. This information, while generally unknown, has been known and debated by a select group of scholars for the last 40 years. I am of the opinion that these scholars think that people beyond their academic circle are not intelligent enough to understand the truth about history. Michael Bradley has dared to put some forbidden subjects on the agenda for discussion. He has rendered a service that we will not be universally thanked for, but it is a service nonetheless. After reading this chapter, I strongly suggest the reading of two very neglected works by Professor Alvin Boyd Kuhn, who is the King of Glory. In my opinion, is one of the clearest books writing on the Christ story, and Shadow of the Third Century, another ably written book by the early rise of a book about the early rise of Christianity. He concludes this chapter with the statement that Columbus seems to have been born of a basically it's getting at there's a hereditary link to Columbus in the Christ story. That's the illusion, hereditary link between Columbus and maybe so this is what this is what my girl was talking about. This is what Tiffany was talking about. So yeah, Tiffany, I see what you're saying. So it's a hint at Columbus possibly having a Jewish connection. So that's what Tiffany was talking about, that Farrakhan was talking about. So it's a It's something that has been debated in circles and hinted to. Okay, gotcha. Okay, Tiffany, I see what you're talking about. The points that I have been alluding to are summarized by Michael Bradley at the close of chapter 3. Godfrey de Bouillon wanted to create a new Jerusalem in the Holy Land where the three great faiths of the West could be reconciled. He failed, but this sort of crusade is what apparently motivated Christopher Columbus and his supporters and financial backers. His voyage may have been a crusade to establish a new Jerusalem in the New World, and I think that this is the light in which we should view his motivations. It is also a perspective and a light that will permit some insight into the anomalous fact that unlikely coincidences in his life. He seems to have been a part of an ancient noble conspiracy to create a world of religious totalitarian between Jews, Christians, and Muslims. A new Jerusalem, I think, was Columbus's concept of a crusade, and an only worthwhile kind of crusade. So more allusion to maybe to Columbus and his Jewish ties, or even his Jewish hereditary. Attempts to unravel the Columbus mystery have not been left to only a few scholars. There have been long debates and some serious questions raised in academic circles without any appreciable public attention being raised. African-American scholars such as J.A. Rogers, Carter G. Woodson, and William Leo Hansberry have raised this question in their works. In an essay, The Origins of Racism in the Americas, by the Caribbean writer Jan Carew, in the book African Themes, Northwestern University Studies, in honor of Gwendolyn M. Carter, infers that Columbus's exploration to the New World was the possible origin of the present day racism. His statement is as follows: "It is extraordinary that in the 482 years since the Arawakian Lucoyan of San Salvador discovered Columbus and the sailors on their beaches, so little research has been done to the origins of racism in the New World. This paucity of research is all the more astonishing when one considers that patterns of race relations and systems of caste, color, and class have not changed a great deal in the 4 3/4 centuries of the Columbus era. But before examining the subject of racism in the New World in Columbian times, we should consider briefly 2 important early visits to the New World. One, 5 centuries before Columbus, Norsemen sailed to Greenland, Labrador, and points out such of St. Lawrence's estuary, and to the pre-Columbian times, Africans visited the Americas. The most notable expedition taking place, Arab Chronicles tells us in 1310, when the Emperor of Mali determined to extend his empire beyond the western reaches of its Atlantic shores, sailed with 400 ships to the New World. The shadowy precursors of both Columbus and the African slave have a distinct bearing on the subsequent events and played a significant role in laying the foundation of a new civilization in the Americas. In chapter 5 of his book, Michael Bradley maintains that there could have been 2 Columbuses, one being a master pirate of French descent and the other being Christopher Columbus of history. He points to the documents that made him arrive at this conclusion and the circumstances that tend to prove that the truth of his conclusion is at least a possibility. In chapter 6, Michael Bradley again alludes to the possible Jewish origins of Christopher Columbus, and that the purpose of his voyage had a mission extended beyond discovery and the search for gold. He points to some evidence that tends to indicate a religious meaning of a voyage that is rooted in some of the conflicts and mysteries beyond the origin of Christianity. Michael Bradley has put on the agenda a subject that might start another crusade, a crusade to kill Michael Bradley in order to shut him up. To fully understand Michael Bradley's book, it might be necessary to go away from the massive information of the book, new and old, and to look at the period of European history from 1400 through 1600. After the Crusades and the period of plagues and famines, Europe had lost 1/3 of its population. The Africans and the Arabs, who had been controlling Spain in the Mediterranean since the year 711, were still in control, though that control had begun to weaken. Europeans were short of food and the ability to preserve food. They wanted and needed access to spices, sweets, and preservatives of Asia in order to continue to survive. This is the period when some of the conflict between the various factions of the Catholic Church was settled by the marriage of Queen Isabella and Ferdinand of Spain. It was also the period when Spain regained her sovereignty and drove out the Arabs and African colonial masters, collectively called Moors. The Spanish were looking for ethnic and religious purity and therefore expelled the Jews along with the Arabs and the Africans of Muslim faith. This was not only a turning point in the history of Europe, this was a major turning point in the history of the world. This period not only saw the rise of the Atlantic slave trade and the European colonization of most of the world. The Europeans subsequently began to colonize information about the history of the world. They colonized the complementary images and began to infer that whiteness was the image of godness. The most tragic aspect of the colonization of the image was the colonization of the image of God and the characters of the Bible. This is the period when Europeans began to infer that the world was waiting in darkness for Europeans to bring the light. This book has both historical and topical meaning that is still very much with us today. Totally aside from opening up the Caribbean islands, North and South America for European exploration, Christopher Columbus had set in motion the rationale for the destruction and indigenous population that mistakenly referred to as Indians. He had stimulated the Atlantic slave trade. The Africans were used as a rationale to replace the rapidly disappearing Indian. And that's the end of chapter 7. So when we pick up again, we're picking up on chapter 8 and chapter 9. So chapter 8 starts on page 77. And chapter 9 ends on page 86, from 77 to 86. Chapter 8 is the forced migration. But so that's interesting. So once again, me and my girl Tiffany was talking about it. She was telling me how Farrakhan had made a claim that Christopher Columbus had Jewish origins. So there are debates out. So according to Dr. Clark and Eric Williams and all the information that he come across, there are debates on Christopher Columbus potentially having Jewish blood, potentially being connected to the Jews through blood, through his heritage, right? But all in all, it is to set and to create the new world for the Europeans. Give the Europeans a new place to build their empire outside of Europe, to extend Europe and extend their reach and extend their power and extend their bloodline, their legacies. And they use the labor of others. They use the resources of others to expand themselves. But it was to build Europe back up to become a world power like Europe was in the past. And they had to get rid of the blacks to do it. The blacks and anybody who thought to be black, half black, quarter black, a drop of black, whatever. They had to get them up out of there. So get your copy of Christopher Columbus, the African Holocaust, the slavery and the rise of European capitalism. So so once again, picking up on chapter 8, next 8 and 9, forced migration and the slave trade in the New World, picking up. So also get your copies of Bartolome de las Casas, a short account of the destruction of the Indies, if you don't have it. From Columbus to Castro, a history of the Caribbean, and Christopher Columbus's The Four Voyages. So you can understand more about Columbus. And we got to dive more into Eric Williams, and this from Columbus to Castro is an Eric Williams book. So dive more into Columbus to figure out more behind the why behind the slave trade for Europe as well. So hit that like button, comment, subscribe, share. If you don't hit that like button, then you don't really like me. You don't really like black people. You don't really like Dr. Clark. Hit that like button. Make sure more people can get this information. We got to spread this information, and we got to use this information so we can build ourselves up, understanding the whys behind why we are where we are. Love you all. Make sure y'all catch the next video coming up, and have a happy Monday.